After Dave introduces the overall sprint objective, Luis joins him at the front of the table. Now that Dave has shared the objective of the sprint with us, he'll take us through each individual item that he's selected from the product backlog to help us meet that objective. As Dave introduces each backlog item, we'll estimate its complexity. This will give Dave a better understanding of the investment required for each item. It will also give us an idea of how many product backlog items that we believe we can deliver as a team over the next 2 weeks. But we won't be estimating in hours or days, we'll be estimating in complexity points. Alan explains, given the inherent unknown of software development, estimating how long it will take to complete a software development task that you've never attempted before is pretty difficult. Plus, humans are generally pretty bad at estimating time, especially in exact amounts. But humans are actually pretty good at estimating how large a problem seems relative to another problem. For example, I like to do crossword puzzles. If I flip through a book of crossword puzzles, I can't really estimate how long it would take me to solve each puzzle completely. There are just too many differences between each puzzle. But I can flip through that book and estimate which puzzles seem harder than others based on information like the number of clues at the bottom, the number of intersections in each answer, or the average length of each answer. Although I don't know how hard each puzzle is, I can get a pretty good feel that the third puzzle seems harder than the second, which in turn may seem harder than the first. Estimating product backlog items in complexity points rather than hours allows us to remove time from the equation and instead think only about how complex a given item seems. We'll then use those complexity points to forecast how much work we can do each sprint. Normally teams have a general understanding of how many complexity points that they can complete per sprint based on the number of complexity points that they've completed in previous sprints. In fact, we call this number the team's velocity. A team can use their previous velocity to help forecast the work that they expect to complete in their next sprint, even adjusting it down as necessary to account for variables such as the entire team being off for a few days to observe a major holiday, or an individual team member taking a significant amount of vacation time during the sprint. But since this is your first sprint, we'll simply ask you to tell us when you feel that we've selected the most work that the team can complete in 2 weeks, and we'll stop there. During the next sprint, we'll look at the actual number of complexity points completed by the team, and we'll use that as our guide for the amount of work to load into that sprint. After Dave introduces the first item, which is the ability to export the profit and loss report as CSV, Luis hands each member of the development team a handful of cards. On each card is a number, and while the numbers start from 1 and increase from there, not every number is represented. Once the cards are distributed, he says, we'll use these cards to estimate as a team how many complexity points each item is. Luis continues, we'll be using a technique called planning poker to estimate each item that Dave has selected for the sprint. Planning poker allows the team to arrive collaboratively at an estimate for each item and prevents a single team member from dominating the conversation. But I should add, Alan interjects, that technically the Scrum framework doesn't specify that teams must arrive at estimates using planning poker. Instead, it just requires that all product backlog items have estimates, and that these estimates are given by those who are actually doing the work before any items can be added to the sprint. But that said, many teams have been very successful with planning poker when first adopting Scrum. Luis and I discussed this, and we agreed that we would give planning poker a try for a few sprints to see how it works for us. With this explanation out of the way, Luis moves on to explaining the Fibonacci sequence. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Fibonacci sequence, I'll explain it now. It's a mathematical sequence where each number is the sum of the previous two numbers. The sequence actually starts 0, 1, 1, 2, but we only include a single card for 1 since we don't need duplicates. This means that the gap between each item increases as the sequence increases. In particular, the gaps at the beginning of the sequence are smaller, but they start to increase exponentially as the sequence progresses. This increase is very advantageous for our purposes of estimating complexity because it helps to convey that the complexity of each item, and therefore the inherent unknown associated with it, increases exponentially as the item grows larger. You'll also notice the question mark at the end of your decks. This card was added to your decks as a way to signal items that are simply too large to reasonably estimate. Feel free to throw this card whenever you encounter an item that you feel the team doesn't know enough about to estimate, and you feel that either it needs more discussion or even that it needs to be broken down into smaller items that are then each estimated individually. Now that Dave has explained the intent of the first product backlog item, I'd like for each of us to take a moment to think about how complex each item is. Now I realize that complexity is a bit of an abstract concept, so to help us get started, Alan and I have chosen a few features that we've worked on recently and assigned complexity scores to each of them to use as reference points. The first feature was the online help that we created for our financial analysis app. This was a pretty straightforward problem since the help content already existed and we'd implemented several similar pieces of search functionality into the app prior. So we assigned this feature a complexity value of 2. The next feature was adding the pie chart that visualizes a breakdown of the categories of a user's business expense over the previous year. That one was interesting since while we were all pretty familiar with the concept of a business expense and we already knew how the underlying data was structured, it was our first attempt at visualizing anything in this product, so we all had to first learn how to use the new charting library. Since the introduction of the new charting library introduced a bit of unknown in itself, we assigned this feature a complexity value of 8. Finally, we all remember the tax deduction report that we created last fall. This report was one of the toughest features that we tackled in some time. We didn't have the necessary data in a format that we needed to calculate the deductions, and then even after the data had been transformed, we discovered that we really didn't understand the business rules behind how different expenses could be deducted. This meant that finishing the report dragged on for weeks as we discovered and worked through all the edge cases and tax laws that we encountered. Since this report was so difficult to do, we've assigned it a complexity score of 21. Alan adds, there's one more thing I want to make sure everyone understands. Because of the intentionally vague nature of complexity points, what each value represents will be different to each team. For example, a development team of 5 people may complete 25 points in a 2-week sprint, while another development team of 5 people may only complete 13 points in that same 2-week sprint. This doesn't mean that the second team only worked half as hard as the first team. More likely, both teams put forth the same amount of effort, but each team has a different concept of how large a complexity point is. For complexity points to work as an estimation scheme, each team needs to have the freedom to select reference items that make sense to them and to accept that those reference items will start to shift over time. The important takeaway here is not to get too hung up on how many complexity points to initially assign to each item that you're using for reference, because your estimation scheme will eventually diverge from other teams as time goes on. The important point is that you create those reference items in the first place so that your team has somewhere to start from.